So this presentation is on content area instruction, and I know it might be surprising considering that we've been talking about these different components of the SIOP model all along, but I thought that there was some specific topics within each content area that we could address. So I've kind of included all of that in this presentation. So the questions I aim at addressing here are: why is it important to include both content and language objectives? We've discussed this, but it's worth, I think, just mentioning again. What are the benefits of an integrated thematic approach to content area instruction for ELLs? What do languages of mathematics, science, and social studies include, and who is responsible for teaching them? How can teachers integrate culture into their content area instruction? And how can teachers differentiate their instruction for the ELLs in their classrooms? So some background here is that ELLs face the challenge of learning to listen, speak, read, and write in English all at the same time while they're expected to meet grade level academic content standards. And this has been, we mentioned this in the very beginning of the semester, but just worth reiterating that they are expected to do both. So the U.S. school system does not allow students to attain proficiency in English before learning the academic content. Otherwise, students would fall woefully behind than maybe some of them already are. And ELLs are capable of doing both when the instruction is specially designed. So we know that ELLs can understand the content while also learning on their English proficiency, but the instruction needs to be carefully designed so that language and content are being considered. The strongest program models are bilingual programs. We went over this in one of the first few weeks of the courses. But content area, that's when the content area is taught in the home language, and then slowly those structures that we've put in place there are taken away there. The scaffolding is taken away. It's the best assurance that ELLs will not fall behind academically while they're working on their English acquisition. Unfortunately, not every school offers bilingual programs, so not every student has that same luxury. So the Understanding Language Initiative outlines 6 key principles for ELL instruction, and that's that instruction focuses on discipline-specific practices, which are designed to build conceptual understanding and language competence. Instruction leverages ELL's home language, cultural assets, and prior knowledge. Standards-aligned instruction for ELLs is rigorous, grade level, and provides deliberate and appropriate scaffolds. Instruction moves ELLs forward by taking into account their English proficiency level and prior schooling experiences. Instruction fosters ELL's autonomy by equipping them with the strategies necessary to comprehend and use language in a variety of academic settings. And diagnostic tools and formative assessment practices are employed to measure students' content knowledge, academic language competence, and participation. So hopefully, as I was reading through these, you could see where a lot of these expectations and these principles have been addressed in other components of the SIOP model in other topics that we've discussed in this course. And although we haven't gotten into the assessment piece or the evaluation piece of the SIOP model, you can see how a lot of what we've been working on these components aligns directly to this. The SIOP model provides a valuable tool for helping educators plan, deliver, and evaluate effective instruction. So differentiated instruction for ELLs and content areas. And although we haven't necessarily addressed differentiation specifically, we have been talking about how we go about doing that for our smaller groups of ELLs. All students we know differ in prior knowledge, academic proficiency, learning styles, and sociocultural backgrounds. So one size fits all instruction is incredibly problematic, and not just for ELLs, but for any student who just may not be at that average or medium level that teachers are teaching at.
Any staff or senior that needs tea lunch, you are dismissed to the cafeteria to pick up food or go directly to the gold gym.
And this seminal court case, Lau versus Nichols, was mentioned earlier in this semester. This is the court case that requires, it is now by law, teachers have to provide students, with the tools that they need to become successful, regardless of language background, educational levels, that sort of thing. So teachers cannot just provide all students with the exact same curricular materials or lesson and instruction because it fails to address, especially for ELLs, the unique language and academic needs. So it's according to federal law, we have to do this as teachers. Differentiated instruction is a great way to remedy all of this. So teachers use information then to differentiate the instruction for students so that, especially for this class and our focus, ELLs can achieve academically and continue to develop the English they need for their academic success. So language and content area objectives, we've mentioned this before, it's one of the components of the SIOP model, but it is crucial to include both language objectives and content area objectives in your lesson plans. Reflects that the content area teacher is also the language teacher. So this is a really important idea. Students can see that my content area teacher is also supporting me with my language. And while that's being mentioned, it is important to stress, again, that this doesn't replace ESL instruction. There should still be an ESL teacher or an English language development teacher who is working specifically on that language acquisition. There's also a focus on helping all students understand the concepts and on helping ELLs learn the language necessary to communicate with others in accomplishing academic tasks that are related to the content area concept. So when you have both language and content area objectives listed, it shows that we're stressing both, we're valuing both in this class. And it's also one way to provide differentiated instruction. You're making it very clear that language is a part of what you're focusing on. So I've included an example here at the bottom of the slide. So this is content and language objectives. Students will be able to identify and describe the stages of a water cycle. This is for a science class. Create a poster illustrating the stages of the water cycle in sequence. So this is the content that we're focusing on. The language then is to use oral and written English and key vocabulary with members of a group to identify the stages of the cycle, describe each stage, and explain the importance of those stages. Use oral and written English to collaborate with other students to plan and develop a water cycle poster. And then make an oral presentation to the class in which the group identifies, describes, and explains the stages of the water cycle using sequencing language. So you can see here how language is the focus at the bottom. I will say one thing to keep in mind, and this is what we talked about when we specifically addressed the SIOP component, is that you want to make sure the language is appropriate for the students that you're teaching. This is something you want to address with them at the beginning of the lesson and then even come back to at the end of the lesson. So it should be in language that's appropriate for them. So using English language standards then to guide our content area instruction. English language proficiency standards of the WIDA Consortium, along with those of individual states, are used to guide English language development instruction and also academic content area instruction. The specific standards focus on language ELLs need to communicate information, ideas, and concepts that are necessary for academic success. They also provide a useful tool for differentiating content area instruction for ELLs based on their English proficiency. So especially for the second bullet, this is where WIDA comes into play. Those can-do descriptors are really important because as long as you receive the level of English proficiency that a student is at, you can then go to those can-do descriptors and know this is the thing, these are the things that a student can do in reading and writing and speaking. And so then that helps you create those lessons or create those activities where you're supporting that student. There are descriptions and examples of observable language behaviors of ELLs at different levels of English proficiency. So the WIDA website is really, really helpful, but those can-do descriptors are wonderful. So strategies for modifying textbooks and instructional materials. Oftentimes, this is the biggest burden, especially for some content areas over others, because the language is just so cumbersome in a textbook. And we never want to just hand an ELL student a textbook from a younger grade and say, well, this one might be a little bit easier for you to understand. It sends the wrong message, and this presentation will get into that a little bit, but you want to make sure you are offering another way that they can access that information without feeling like, oh, I'm not as smart as, or I'm dumb, that's why I have to use this different grade level information. So grade level content area materials are not developed typically with ELLs in mind. Although if you'd have a newer textbook series, those series have been better at offering different, like differentiated reading material for English language learners, but I have to say overall, there's not much out there. Modifications, may be required then to make grade level content area instruction materials accessible. So some things that you can do as a teacher is outline the information from a passage, so then they just have that outlined information to work with, which is less cumbersome for them. Graphic organizers, pausing to paraphrase, especially if you're reading aloud, that's a great opportunity to summarize with them. Explain or provide examples. Instruction and practice using textbook aids. So if you have a textbook that you really do rely on a lot, showing English language learners the table of contents and how you use that and how that can help them. Same thing with the index, the chapter titles, chapter summaries, where they could go to get the summary if they're getting lost in the details. Graphics and visuals, all of these other tools that we use, these aids that are provided in the textbook to help us navigate the information and understand it better, making sure that we're spending time to go over that with our English language learners. So thematic teaching is selecting a theme that can be explored in all content areas. Oftentimes schools may have like team teaching where each teacher in the grade level team focuses on some sort of theme, and then every subject area kind of dives into the theme however they can. We know that this is a solution for teachers, especially those teachers who are really feel pressured, they're up against the clock to meet the standards before state tests, for example. This is a way for them to address as much as possible by using these themes and kind of dividing and conquering. It also allows easy crossover among content areas. You can see the connection between content areas. So an example here is a science lesson on weather could incorporate elements of math, art, writing, and so we really do see it's cross-curricular in that sense. But this builds and provides students background knowledge, and it facilitates comprehensible input, because if they're going from their science class to their math class and they're both talking about weather, they're then building that background knowledge. When they get to the next class, they have more to work with. They have that better understanding, and they can continue to understand and add all of that input, that information. So it is really helpful for English language learners. Although grade level textbooks are typically written at level and accessible to English language learners, teachers can find other books dealing with the same concepts at more accessible levels. So keep in mind that both fiction and nonfiction with content area themes are appropriate. So even if you're able to find a different text, that's an option. With secondary students, teachers might be tempted, like I mentioned, to use textbooks from different grade levels. And so it really does send a message that ELLs are less capable than their grade level peers. So I would encourage you to find other ways to go about presenting that information, but use scaffolding to help English language learners access the important information. So maybe you provide them with an outline first, and then you show them how they can outline a section of it. And then that outlining tool then becomes something that they've worked with and that they can now use moving forward in even other classes when they don't understand the information. So sheltered instruction, this is what we've been talking about. Teachers can shelter their instruction to make math, science, social studies comprehensible for the ELLs in their classes. 5 topics that teachers should consider when sheltering and differentiating their content area instruction are the language of the content area. So what type of language is being used typically in the resources, making instruction comprehensible to ELLs, modifying instructional materials, using literature, and integrating students' cultures. So as we take a look at over the next few slides, these different content areas, I'll try to break it down to explain these 5 topics in a little bit more detail. So we know math is one of the main subjects that are covered on state tests, which means that it tends to get a lot of attention in the classroom and a lot of focus. There's definitely a pressure to push through instruction at a rapid pace so that all these concepts are covered before the assessment period. So it's really important for ELLs to receive that comprehensible math instruction to avoid falling behind their grade level peers, because math is cumulative. It's not like English where it's circular almost, where our skills are being addressed and readdressed with different pieces of literature. Also, the basic concepts in math need to be mastered before students can move on to more advanced concepts. So it's easy to fall behind quickly when you're not understanding the language. Common Core brought about three major shifts in math education. So they narrowed the scope of math concepts, especially at the elementary level. They emphasized coherence across and within grades, and they emphasized rigor within major topics so that students can develop conceptual understanding. So the language of math. There's a major misperception about math, and it's that ELLs understand it easier because it's mostly just numbers. And we know that research shows math tests have a high language demand typically, and it poses significant difficulties for ELLs. The language of math has unique vocabulary and syntax and unique semantic properties and text features. So I tried to include just a couple examples here. Divisor, denominator, quotient, they're rarely used outside of math. So these are specific vocabulary that needs to be taught to English language learners. Otherwise, they're lost in this math lesson. Table, column, and face have specific meanings just for math. So how we understand those three words typically outside of a math classroom are very different than what they mean in a math classroom. And the syntax of math can be confusing for ELLs. Often there's no one-to-one correspondence between words and the symbols that they represent. So if you take a look at the example, x is less than 22, that takes way more words to express x and then the less than sign 22. So that can be a little bit tricky as well. The word order may differ the way that numbers and symbols appear in a numeric sentence. So the x plus y squared actually reads the square of the sum of x and y. And so just the order of the language is tricky for students. Word problems, hopefully you're remembering back to our discussion, but word problems can be particularly challenging because they contain complex syntax and difficult, usually irrelevant vocabulary. And many of you discussed this with our discussion post, that just the information that was presented in that word problem was irrelevant. It requires vocabulary knowledge and English reading comprehension skills. So you really have to question at what point is this a reading test and not a math test anymore. So ELLs who are highly skilled in math have difficulty demonstrating the skills until they attain enough proficiency in the linguistic demands of the math instruction and assessment. Another challenge is that newcomer ELLs have learned math symbols and algorithms for problem solving in their home country, and that those may actually differ from those that are taught in the US. So in several Asian countries, the decimal is used to separate place value and the comma is used for number values that are less than 1. That's the exact opposite of how we use it here in the United States. And algorithms for long division differ substantially in other countries. So most countries emphasize mental math, which makes the process of showing your work like a waste of time. In fact, this specific example of doing mental math, like the prioritizing mental math over showing your work, seems to be the biggest struggle that I see with the English language learners that I support at my high school. They really struggle with math because they're not used to getting so much credit for showing their work, and they're able to get the same answer, but they can't necessarily put that down on paper, and that ends up being working to a disadvantage for them. So making instruction comprehensible. To make students learn the vocabulary and language structures of math, teachers can they can illustrate math word charts to go along with math units. So geometric shapes or measurement words. They can use manipulatives to help them understand concepts that they might not fully grasp. So pattern blocks, sorting manipulatives, counting manipulatives, the pie slices, the clocks, the money, the play money. The manipulatives also allow ELLs to demonstrate their understanding without having to rely on spoken or written words. So sometimes that can be used as an alternative assessment as well, when language is a little bit more of an issue. Bilingual strategies and technologies can be used to enhance or support math instruction. So there are software programs that can help students understand and practice math concepts. Oftentimes they're in the context of like games or other entertaining activities, and so students really enjoy it as well. And then integrating cultures into math instruction. It's not simply writing word problems with ethnic names or dealing with supposedly cultural content like we saw in that example I used for the discussion post. So while word problems should have a diversity, we need to make sure that we're avoiding any sort of offensive stereotypes with how we're presenting that. So we want to help students instead connect math to their own lives, in their families, communities, and the world. So math instruction can include discussions of the multicultural history of math, contribution of Indian and Arabic mathematicians, and that allows for culture in this specific classroom. So science, we know, is a popular subject for sheltered instruction. It's a fan favorite of my English language learners. And my guess is that because there are a lot of tangible concepts and processes, it allows for a lot of hands-on learning. And that it helps English language learners understand that material much easier. So science tends to receive less attention because of the heavy federal testing requirements that are typically in math and reading, especially in schools in high poverty areas that also typically have large numbers of English language learners. Federal policy requires that students are tested in science 3 times between grade 3 and high school. So many schools, once this was put into place, many schools realized the cost of having neglected science instruction. And so there is much more of a growing attention to the need for students and workers with expertise in STEM fields. And this has set the stage for science to make a real comeback. So the next generation science standards. These are grounded in the framework for K-12 science education. It's considered to be college and career readiness standards and are fully aligned with the requirements of Every Student Succeeds Act. These next generation standards are not a science curriculum, but rather student performance expectations. So very similar to just standards, right? They indicate what students should know and be able to do at the end of each grade level. This also initiated shifts in science education that promoted language learning with ELL. So there's a focus on explaining phenomena and designing solutions to problems. There's also this 3-dimensional learning, and that features scientific and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts that unify the study of science and engineering through common applications across fields. Core ideas and 4 disciplinary ideas: physical sciences, life sciences, earth and space sciences, and engineering, technology, and applications of science, and then learning progressions. So these shifts are conducive to promoting science learning and include a focus on using language for authentic communication purposes, which is really important for our students. So the language of science can be confusing for English language learners because it uses words from everyday life that have different meanings. So plate means one thing in our everyday life, but plate tectonics means something completely different. Same thing with cell and cell phone, and tissue, how we use it in science, and tissue, how we use it when we need to sneeze. So students will, just like math, will need to learn many new vocabulary words for each topic they encounter in science. And they'll need to learn to talk the talk of science. And that comes along with these communicative activities where they're forced to use it. So you need to learn to ask questions, form hypotheses, learn to make predictions and develop explanations, learn to design experiments, collect data, identify and manipulate variables, record their results, draw conclusions, and then collaborate with others and communicate their findings in the genre of a science report, which we know is very different than an English essay or a history essay. So ELLs are at a disadvantage because they have less experience with the genre and the register that is expected for science assignments. So labs and other science reports have that specific genre and textual structure. And so ELLs will need to learn that for sure. So making instruction comprehensible. Inquiry-based or discovery science is an effective means for helping our English language learners successfully learn concepts and also develop their language skills. It's supported by those next generation science standards, and it includes processes that are at the heart of science instruction, like observing, using space-time relationships, classifying, measuring. There's also lots of hands-on activities which provide rich language opportunities for students to explore real experiences using purposeful language. So teachers need to ensure that their science classroom is a community of practice conducive to science and language learning. Modifying science instructional materials. So mainstream science textbooks pose considerable challenges for ELLs. There's high density of information, technical language, and complex sentences. one of the best ways to give ELLs access to the concepts of science is to get the concepts off the pages of the textbook. So using those outlines, those graphic organizers to support students. So integrating cultures into science. The National Science Teachers Association emphasizes the importance of valuing contributions and uniqueness of culturally and linguistically diverse students. So children from all cultures are to have equitable access to quality science education experiences that enhance success and provide the knowledge and opportunities required to them to become successful participants in our society. Curricular content must incorporate the contributions of many cultures to our knowledge of science. Science teachers should be knowledgeable about and use culturally related ways of learning and instructional practices. And instructional strategies selected for use with all children must recognize and respect differences students bring in their cultures. So the use of fiction and nonfiction literature to support what's being discussed in science allows students to share contributions, or allows a teacher to share contributions from different cultures. And students should engage in science inquiry about issues that affect them, their families, and their communities. So how does it relate to them personally? So social studies is a broad label covering lots of different disciplines. It's the integrated study of the social sciences and humanities to promote civic competence. So really anthropology, archaeology, economics, geography, history, law, philosophy, political science, psychology, religion, sociology, and appropriate content from the humanities, math, and natural sciences. So it really is an umbrella term in the broadest sense. Through these disciplines, social studies teaches about culture, though, time, continuity, people, places, environment, institutions, power, many, many more things. So this particular subject is really an important content area for English language learners. The language of social studies deals with abstractions, and that makes this incredibly difficult for English language learners. So I tried to include an example here. The term American Revolution, that's something that's thrown around a lot, and by high school students know what the American Revolution is. English language learners who may not have that background information are lost because it's such a loaded term, and it really does need to be unpacked. And if you take a look at how I tried to unpack it, you'd have to explain America was originally a colony of England. Then some Americans felt like England was treating them unfairly. They wanted to be independent from England, so they fought a war against England from 1775 to 1783. This war is called the American Revolution. America won the war, and now they're an independent nation. But even within that breakdown, notice the language that's being used: colony, unfairly, independent, war, revolution, nation. These are all vocabulary terms that now need to be explained because they may be foreign to an English language learner. So very tricky language here. Another linguistic challenge is how time is marked and how sequence is distinguished from setting in time. So setting in time is a term that we use. It combines a series of events into one chunk, like the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. And it allows us to talk about periods ranging from one day to millions of years. Maybe I'm exaggerating with that one, but a long period of time. So this can be difficult for English language learners also. But teaching key vocabulary in social studies and providing background knowledge as best you can was certainly much more helpful than anything else you can do, because they need that background understanding and information. So how do we make it comprehensible? We need to find out what students already know about a particular topic or concept. So KWL charts are really helpful. What do you already know? What do you want to learn? And then after you read or have your lesson, what have you learned? Those can be really helpful. The field offers a wide variety of visuals that can help make instruction more comprehensible. So there's portraits of historical people, the photographs, tons of videos online. So that really does work to the benefit of a social studies teacher. It also enables students to explore current events and the history behind them and understand the way that these events affect them and their families and their communities. And then there are also online educational games that can make it more engaging, more comprehensible. So modifying the instructional materials. Because of the abstract language, we know that social studies textbooks can be especially challenging. So read alouds are really helpful. Completing those before, during, and after strategies. Lower level English language learners can be paired with a buddy who can then help them understand along the way. Audio for students to listen to while they're reading along. That helps them learn the pronunciation of unfamiliar words. So sometimes they've heard a word before, but they don't know necessarily, oh, that's the word I've heard before. So the audio can be helpful for that reason. But also if they're not sure how to pronounce it, the audio is helpful in that regard as well. And then making new connections between words they know orally but may not recognize. Graphic organizers, certainly very helpful. So there's also this 10 important sentences strategy, and this just is where you're focusing just on the main ideas of a text. You're getting just the basic essence of a text, and that can be really helpful too, because then they're getting that core information. So integrating cultures, the easiest way to incorporate students' cultures into a social studies class is to make them the focus of the study. So if the ethnic and cultural groups represented by the students in your class, school, community are not represented in your social studies text, create your own unit where your students and their cultures become the focus. Students-owned communities also offer excellent resource for learning about cultures other than their own. So art, music, and physical education. The arts, we know that these areas tend to get de-emphasized or eliminated altogether. So the Consortium of National Arts reminds us the arts are inseparable from the very meaning of the term education. And so it's this idea that to deny English language learners and other students arts instruction is to deny them the opportunity to become educated. And I love that the way that that's put. But the arts can offer a means of reflection, higher order thinking, expression, and communication. And then physical education, despite wide recognition of the obesity crisis, more and more schools are reducing their PE programs, especially at the elementary level. So the National Standards for K-12 Physical Education describes a physically literate individual as one who achieves and maintains a health-enhancing level of physical activity and fitness, values physical activity for such reasons as health, enjoyment, challenge, self-expression, and social interaction, who's able to demonstrate competency in a variety of motor skills and movement patterns, and who exhibits responsible personal and social behavior that respects self and others. So because art, music, and PE typically carry less of a language demand than math, science, and social studies, ELLs often participate in them much more easily and quickly excel right off the bat, right from the beginning. And that's because these classes transcend language barriers. There are ways to communicate and engage that don't require verbal language or oral language. There are specific ways of using language associated with these classes, as well as content, concepts, and theories that are beyond surface level activities. And so sometimes it does require higher levels of English proficiency. So assessing the content areas. Teachers must ensure that assessment is a valid measure of the student's knowledge of the content and not a measure of their language proficiency. And one perfect example that comes to mind are those math word problems. Performance assessments and other forms of alternative assessments should mirror the activities students do when learning in each content area. So for science, students' understanding of different cycles can be assessed by asking a student to arrange pictures depicting each stage of the cycle in the correct sequence. For PE, students can self-assess by keeping a log of their exercise, their heart rates, or calories, other physical activities. But the language objectives associated with each content area should be assessed using formal and informal assessments. And then just to wrap this up, to be successful in school and in life, ELLs must be given access to the core curriculum that equals that of their English-speaking peers. So instruction in the content areas must be comprehensible for them. The SIOP model is one popular model that can help teachers plan, deliver, and evaluate effective sheltered content area instruction because of those language and content area objectives. And because of the wide range of abilities among ELLs and other students, it is imperative that teachers differentiate their instruction. Ongoing formal and informal authentic assessments in the content areas offer multiple measures and therefore a valid depiction of ELL's academic achievement.